So it's time to edit our state and add more coaches. We now got the form in place, so we got all we need. Inside of that form, inside of the coach form component, we now just need to expose the data that was entered, so this form data here, to the component that uses coach form, which is the coach registration component. Theoretically, we could also directly reach out to the store from inside of coach form, because ultimately we can interact with Vuex stores from any component. But I like this component to be reusable and independent and just work with its parent, even though we only use it in one part of this app here. This is just a personal decision though, so I will make sure that this component rather emits an event and lets the parent know about the data that was entered, and then the parent, so the coach registration component in this case, will do the communication with Vuex. But that's just one possible way of approaching this. However, with that, in coach form, I'll emit, here in submit form, I'll emit save data and emit the form data. And yes, this data is not validated at the moment. We'll add this later. So now this is emitted. And that of course means that we should also add the emits option here and make it clear that we emit save data. And once we did all of that, inside of coach registration, we can accept this incoming data. So there on the coach form, we can listen to save data, which is that custom event we're emitting, and call maybe a method named save data here. Of course, we have yet to add this method. So here I'll add methods, save data. And in here we'll get that form data, which we pass with the event here in coach form. We get this as a parameter, therefore, in the save data method, which we bind to this event in coach registration. And that's good because we need that data here to communicate with our store. So now we want to add a new coach in our Vuex store. And that of course means one thing. We need to add mutations and actions, because you shouldn't directly change your state from outside. Hence, here in this empty mutations object in mutations.js, I'll add a new mutation, register coach. You could of course also name this add coach if you preferred this. And in there, I get my state and my payload. And I now reach out to state coaches and push the payload as a new coach. Now, actually, that would be invalid though, or not really great, because we must keep in mind that payload ultimately is just the form data I'm setting up in coach form. And there I have first, last, and desk as key names. That's not in line with the key names I have in the rest of my data. That's no problem though, because we have to add an action anyways, and I'll transform that data inside of the action. So here in the actions.js file, we now can register coach or add a register coach action, and there we'll get context and also payload, or we can also name this data. It's our method, so we can name the parameters however we want. And that will be this form data in the end. And here I'll then construct my coach data, or my coach, or whatever you want to name it, as a new object, which now has a first name, which points at data.first, which has a last name, which is data.last, which has a description, which is data.desk, which has an hourly rate, which is data.rate, and areas, which is data.areas. I also want to add an ID here, and for that, of course, we can use newDate to ISO string to generate an ID like this, or we hard code this to C3, which of course is not perfect, because that means that as soon as we register twice, we have two coaches with the same ID, but that shouldn't be allowed anyways. You shouldn't be able to register more than once. So I will hard code this for now. Later, we'll send it to a server, and the server will give us a real ID. But for the moment, we can use this dummy hard-coded ID here. So now we got this coach data, and now I can context commit register coach and commit this mutation with that transformed coach data. And therefore now in this mutation, adding this data like this is okay, because that now is in the same format as the other coaches. So now we got this register coach action, and we can therefore now dispatch this in the coach registration component whenever save data is executed. Here we can use this store dispatch and then dispatch coaches/register coach. This is the namespace, this is the action name. And of course, not just like this, but also provide a second argument, which is that data we're getting. And that should now be adding a new coach once we filled out all the details. So with that, if I now reload here and I enter Max, Schwartz, this is a test, 15 and backend. If I register and go back to all coaches, we see that data down there. And of course, we can also view the details. Now, maybe it would be nice if we would automatically be forwarded once we submitted that form, be forwarded to that all coaches page, I mean. And that's something we can simply implement by going back to save data in coach registration and using this $router push to push us to /coaches. Or use something which I haven't shown you before, and that's the replace method on the router. It's also navigating us away, just like push, but the difference is that we can't go back to the page we came from thereafter. And that's good because here I don't want to go back to the form once it is submitted. So that's why I'm using replace instead of push here. Now with that out of the way, let's try this again. Let's reload. And every time we reload, we lose our generated coach, by the way, because it's only stored temporarily in memory. That's why we later add HTTP and a server. So that's why we lose it when we reload at the moment. But that's good because that means we can register the same coach again without having an ID clash. This is a test. Add that data. And now if I register, I'm forwarded to this page. Now I think it would be good if this button would not be available anymore as soon as we did register though. And therefore I want to make sure that we are aware of when that user signed up. And I want to make sure that we can check for the user being a coach by using Vuex. In the root index.js file in the store folder, we currently just registered the coaches module. Here I actually now also want to have some root state. And there I want to manage the ID of the user who's using this app. At the moment, this ID is of course hard-coded. I'll use C3 here. Later, after the authentication course module, we will actually have a real user ID here. For the moment, it's this dummy ID, but that's okay. So we'll have a user ID here, and that user ID should now be used when we sign up as a coach, but should thereafter be used to verify whether we already got a coach with that ID. Now, first of all, here in coaches actions, I no longer want to hard-code the ID here, but instead use this user ID. So for that, thankfully, we can use our context and access the root getters here. Now we just need a root getter that gives us this ID. So in the root index.js file here, I'll add getters and then add a user ID getter where I just return state user ID and get state as a parameter. And now we can use this root getter here in this action by accessing context root getters.userid so that we use the real user ID here. And then here in the coach getters, we can add a isCoach getter, which returns true if the user already is a coach and false otherwise. And here we can utilize the fact that we get the state in a getter, but also other getters, and also the root state and root getters. That's what I showed you in the Vuex module. And therefore here, we want to get our coaches by accessing getters.coaches or state coaches, doesn't really make a difference here. And then we want to look through those coaches and see if we got a coach with our user ID, which we can get from root getters. We get our user ID by accessing rootgetters.userid. And then we can return coaches sum, which is a built-in method that returns true if some coach fulfills a criteria. And here we run a function on every coach and return true if coach ID is equal to user ID. With that, this will return true if we find at least one coach that has our user ID as an ID, which means we are a coach already. Now I got two unused parameters here, which this specific project setup wouldn't like. So here I'll use an underscore and underscore 2 as parameter names, which is a specific convention that signals the linter of this project that I have to take these arguments, but I'm deliberately not using them. Well, and with that, we hopefully get true here if we have a coach with our ID. Of course, the downside of this approach, by the way, is that we always go through all coaches to check whether we are a coach or not. So an alternative way of solving this would be to simply add a new state to our coaches state here, where we say user is coach or something like that, and we set this to true as soon as the user signed up. This is absolutely an alternative. I'll still go with the other approach to also show that, but it's up to you which approach you want to use. With that, however, I have this isCoachGetter, and now in coach registration, we can also add computed properties and add a isCoachComputed property where I return the result of reaching out to this store getters coaches/isCoach, which is that new getter we just worked on. And now we can use the isCoach property to control whether we want to show this register button or not, but I'm in the wrong component as I noticed. So let's cut that and remove that. It's in the coaches list, of course. Here we have this register as coach button. So here in computed, I want to add this isCoachComputed property I just worked on. And now we can use isCoach here with vif to only show this button if not isCoach, so if the user is not a coach yet. With that, if we save this, if I reload, the button is available. But if I now do sign up here as a coach, this hopefully is no longer the case thereafter. Now the button is gone because now I am a coach. So now adding a coach or registering as a coach works, at least in this dummy version. But with that, our core coach feature is pretty much done. There's just one thing missing if I reload. I want to add validation to this form so that we can't submit an empty form because that won't work for us. So that's what we're going to work on next before we thereafter work on the contact and requests features.